Chapter 1. The house that listened it was on a damp autumn evening that I received a most precise complaint from Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, proprietor of a modest boarding house in Bloomsbury. Each night, at exactly 11 minutes past midnight, footsteps passed her bedroom door. They were slow, deliberate, and measured, as though their owner possessed both patience and purpose. Yet no tenant emerged, no latch stirred, and no shadow moved beneath the threshold. The corridor, she insisted, was empty. Fear had begun to circulate among her lodgers like a draught under a door. I observed at once that terror, like rent, may be collected with punctuality. Where there is regularity, there is design, and where there is design, there is the human hand. Mrs. Whitmore herself was a woman of composed habits. She wore her grey hair parted neatly and bound in a coil so severe that it seemed to resist even the suggestion of disorder. Her boarding house at 14 Ashbury Crescent had for 20 years offered quiet rooms and modest respectability to clerks, teachers, widows of limited means, and the occasional travelling salesman who preferred discretion to comfort. It began 3 weeks ago, Mr. Poirot, she said, folding her hands upon her lap. On the first night, I thought it imagination. The house settles, after all. The pipes rattle. But this was no settling, it was pacing. Always at 11 minutes past midnight, I asked. To the minute, she replied. I have looked at my clock each time. I would not trouble you otherwise. I nodded gravely. The precision interested me far more than the phenomenon itself, and you have investigated. I have opened my door at once. The corridor is empty. The gaslight burns steadily. No one is there. And the tenants? She hesitated. Some claim to have heard it. Others deny it. 2 have given notice. They say the house is, she lowered her voice, listening. I raised my eyebrows slightly. Listening. It is foolishness, I know. But they say the walls carry sound in strange ways, that one may hear whispers that do not belong to one's own room. And now the footsteps. There is talk of a former occupant who died here under unhappy circumstances. Ah, there it was. Every unexplained sound acquires, in time, a history. I assured Mrs. Whitmore that I would call that very evening. She seemed relieved, though I could see that her composure was a garment worn thin by repeated disturbance. At 10:30 I arrived at Ashbury Crescent. The house stood in a row of narrow brick facades, indistinguishable from its neighbours, save for a polished brass plate that reflected the lamplight with modest pride. Inside, the air bore the scent of coal fire and lavender polish. The hall was narrow, the carpet worn but clean. A staircase rose steeply to the upper floors. Mrs. Whitmore received me in a small sitting room and introduced 2 of her current lodgers who had agreed to remain awake for observation. Miss Clara Hastings was a music teacher of approximately 35 years, with intelligent eyes and a nervous habit of smoothing her cuffs. She confessed to having heard the footsteps twice. They passed my door as well, she said, slowly, as though someone were counting. Counting, I repeated. Yes, the steps are evenly spaced, not hurried, not uncertain, deliberate. The second lodger, Mr. Pritchard, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, declared that he had heard nothing at all. I retire early, he said, and I sleep soundly. These disturbances are the product of suggestion. His tone implied that he considered himself superior to such influences. There were, I learned, 4 other occupants. Mrs. Beatrice Latham, a widow who occupied the front room on the 2nd floor, Mr. Harold Finch, a retired watchmaker, a young medical student named Thomas Bell, and Miss Eleanor Graves, a typist employed in a solicitor's office. The arrangement of rooms interested me greatly. Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom lay at the rear of the 1st floor. The corridor extended from the staircase, with rooms on either side. The footsteps, she said, approached from the direction of the stairs, passed her door, and continued to the end of the passage, where there was nothing but a blank wall and a small window overlooking the yard. No door at the end, I asked. None, nor cupboard. Only a shallow alcove where a table stands. I examined the corridor myself. The boards were old, but solid. A runner carpet lay along the center. I walked its length several times, noting where it creaked and where it did not. The gaslight flickered faintly but steadily. At 5 minutes to midnight, we extinguished unnecessary lamps. Mrs. Whitmore stood within her doorway. Miss Hastings hovered behind her. Mr. Parker positioned himself near the staircase with an expression of skeptical endurance. I placed myself in the corridor, midway between the stairs and the blank wall. Silence descended. The house, like a living organism, seemed to draw in its breath. The clock in the hall below began to chime the quarter hour. 1 minute passed. 2. Ye confess that in such moments the imagination, even the disciplined imagination, becomes alert to trifles. The tick of cooling pipes, the faint rustle of fabric, the beating of one's own heart. Then, precisely as the minute hand of my watch aligned with its mark, there came the sound. Step, a pause, step measured, unhurried, firm. The sound originated unmistakably at the staircase. It ascended, though no shadow appeared upon the wall. The steps reached the landing. Miss Hastings gave a small gasp. The footsteps continued along the corridor. They approached me. I saw nothing. The carpet before me lay undisturbed, yet the boards beneath it responded with pressure. First one plank, then the next step. They passed within inches of where I stood. I felt, I admit, a curious sensation, not of cold, but of awareness, as though I occupied the path of an invisible procession. The steps continued beyond Mrs. Whitmore's door. Her knuckles whitened against the frame step. Step. They reached the end of the corridor, and stopped. We waited. Nothing further occurred. I moved at once to the end wall. I knelt, examined the carpet, pressed upon the boards. There was no visible depression, no mechanism in sight. Mr. Parker cleared his throat. Air pressure, perhaps, a draft in the stairwell. Air does not place its weight upon alternating planks, I replied gently. Mrs. Whitmore whispered. You heard it then? I heard it, I said. But more importantly, I had observed. The creak of each board had been consistent, not random. The intervals between steps were identical. There was no hesitation, no variation of pace. A human being walking naturally introduces slight irregularities, an adjustment of balance, a shift in stride. These steps were mechanical in their perfection. I requested permission to inspect the staircase and the structure beneath it. Mrs. Whitmore led me below, to a narrow storage space beneath the stairs, cluttered with trunks and disused furniture. By the light of a candle, I examined the underside of the steps. The beams were old oak, solid, without recent alteration, so far as one could see, without dismantling. Has any repair been conducted here recently? I asked. None, she said, not for years. And the former occupant who died, tell me of that. She hesitated. It was nearly 6 years ago. A gentleman named Mr. Adrian Mowbray. He took the back room at the end of the corridor, the one next to mine. He was a quiet man, kept to himself. One morning he was found dead in his bed. Natural causes. The doctor said his heart had failed. There was some talk of distress, financial difficulties. And the room? It has been occupied many times since. I nodded. And yet the footsteps did not begin until 3 weeks ago. Yes. Which meant that whatever had begun, it was not the echo of grief lingering for 6 years. It was something new. We returned upstairs. I requested to see each tenant privately on the following day. Mrs. Whitmore agreed. As I prepared to depart, I paused once more at the corridor's end. I placed my ear against the wall. It was cool, solid brick, but faintly, very faintly, I detected something else. Not a sound, precisely a resonance. Like the memory of a vibration, the house, it seemed, did indeed listen. But houses do not remember without assistance. As I stepped out into the mist-laden street, I reflected that a phenomenon so punctual was not born of superstition. It was engineered. Whether for mischief, intimidation, or concealment remained to be discovered. At 11 minutes past midnight, a performance occurred. The question, as ever, was, for whose benefit, and why at that precise hour? I drew my coat more closely about me and smiled slightly to myself. A house that listens is one thing, But a house that speaks, that is quite another. And I intended to make it speak. Chapter 2. 11 minutes passed. I installed myself in a small armchair opposite Mrs. Whitmore's door and waited. The corridor was long and narrow, its wallpaper faded to a tired cream, its carpet runner thin along the center seam. The air held that faint chill peculiar to houses whose bones are older than their plumbing. A single gas lamp burned low at the head of the stairs, casting a shallow pool of light that failed to reach the corridor's end. At 11 minutes past midnight, precisely, the sound began. 3 slow steps. A pause, then 2 more. They ended just before the stairwell. The floorboards did not creak in protest. Instead, the sound carried as if shaped by the corridor itself, molded and directed along its length. No shadow passed beneath the lamplight, no door latch clicked in sympathy, no breath disturbed the air. It was the echo that interested me most. It gathered near the stairs and then dissolved, as though the corridor swallowed it whole. Someone, I thought, was not walking. Someone was composing. I remained seated for several minutes after the final step, allowing the silence to resettle. Mrs. Whitmore, standing just within her doorway, looked toward me with anxious expectation. "You observe something, Mr. Poirot?" "Everything," I replied gently. "But observation is not yet conclusion." The pattern had altered. The previous evening the steps had traversed the full corridor to its end. Tonight they had halted near the staircase. The number was fewer, 5 instead of the steady progression we had heard before. That difference was not accidental, it was deliberate. A performance, yes, but not a careless one. I rose and walked slowly to the staircase. I counted the boards with the tip of my shoe, applying measured pressure. Each plank responded differently. Some groaned faintly, others were mute. The sound we had heard was neither groan nor creak. It had possessed clarity, almost a resonance, as though the corridor were an instrument and an unseen hand plucked it at chosen points. "Miss Hastings," I said quietly, "you described the steps as evenly spaced. Do you recall their number?" She emerged from her room, pale but composed. 5, she said at once. "Always 5. And the pause after the third." "Yes," she frowned. "It is the pause that troubles me. It feels intentional, as though someone listens in return." An intelligent observation. Mr. Parker, who had again stationed himself by the stairs, adjusted his spectacles. "It is a trick of acoustics. Old houses distort sound. A door closing below may produce the illusion of steps above." "Indeed," I said mildly, "and yet the distortion obeys the clock." He made no reply. I requested permission to examine the staircase once more, this time with greater attention to the vertical structure. Kneeling, I ran my fingers along the banister posts, the underside of the steps, the junction where wood met plaster. There, faint but undeniable, I detected something unusual, a subtle vibration, not present now, but recent. "Has anyone been working in the house?" I asked. "No," said Mrs. Whitmore firmly. "I have neither the means nor the inclination for renovations. Repairs, installations? None." The tenants gathered behind us in various states of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Latham, the widow, clutched a shawl around her shoulders. Mr. Finch, the retired watchmaker, leaned against the wall with a faintly amused expression, as though the entire affair were an entertainment staged for his benefit. The young medical student, Thomas Bell, observed with keen eyes, perhaps anticipating some physiological explanation. Miss Eleanor Graves stood apart, near the end of the corridor. She was a slender young woman with dark hair pinned neatly back. Her expression was unreadable. I watched them all. "The sound," I said at last, rising, "does not originate where it appears." Mrs. Whitmore blinked, "But we heard it on the boards." "You heard it through them." A faint tightening passed across Miss Graves's face. "It was slight, but I am not a man who overlooks slightness. Sound," I continued, "is obedient to structure. It travels along beams, through cavities, across surfaces. In a corridor such as this, narrow and enclosed, resonance may be guided." "Guided," repeated Mr. Hale. "Yes, directed, as one directs a whisper along a tube. Mr. Parker gave a short laugh. You suggest someone has constructed a device in a boarding house corridor? I suggest nothing yet. I observe only that regularity implies intention. I dismissed the company for the night and remained alone in the corridor for nearly an hour. Silence prevailed, no repetition occurred. The pattern, therefore, was confined to that precise minute. The next morning I began my interviews. Mrs. Beatrice Latham received me in her sitting room. She was a woman of gentle manner and persistent anxiety. I do not like it, she confessed. I hear them clearly 5 steps. Always 5. They pass my door and vanish. I have taken to placing a chair against it. Why 5? I asked casually. I cannot say. Does the number suggest anything to you? A date, a time, a room? She hesitated. Mr. Mowbray's room was the 5th from the stairs. Interesting. And you recall his death? Very well. It unsettled the house for months. He was troubled, walked often at night. How many steps from the stairs to his door? She frowned, thinking 5, I believe. A coincidence, possibly, but coincidences, like debts, accumulate. Next I spoke with Mr. Harold Finch. He professed indifference. I travel frequently, he said. I am here only 2 nights a week. I have heard nothing unusual. And yet you remain. He smiled thinly. I am not afraid of sounds. No, I said softly, only of meaning. His gaze flickered. The young medical student, Thomas Bell, proved more forthcoming. The acoustics are peculiar, he admitted. When I dropped a book in my room, the impact sounded as though it came from the corridor. I examined the floorboards. They seem hollow beneath. Hollow. There is a crawl space between levels, perhaps larger than usual. Have you entered it? The access panel is in the cellar, but it appears sealed. Sealed, finally, I requested to see Miss Eleanor Graves. Her room was orderly to the point of severity. A small writing desk stood near the window, papers arranged with geometric precision. You have heard the steps? I asked. Yes. Do they disturb you? She met my gaze steadily. Number? Why not? Because they are not supernatural. Ah, they are human, she said. Or mechanical. And which do you prefer? Neither, she replied coolly. There was intelligence there, and restraint. I noticed upon her desk a metronome, the sort used by musicians to maintain tempo. You play? I asked lightly. It belonged to my brother. And you keep it for memory. For discipline, she said. I inclined my head. As I left her room, I felt the faintest tremor beneath my feet, not of sound, but of intention. The house did not merely carry noise. It transmitted it, like a wire. That afternoon, I persuaded Mrs. Whitmore to grant me access to the cellar. It was dim and cluttered, smelling of damp stone and old coal. Along the ceiling ran the exposed beams supporting the floors above. He examined them carefully. There, near the base of the staircase, I found what I sought. A narrow metal conduit, scarcely thicker than a pencil, fastened discreetly along the beam and disappearing into the cavity beneath the stairs. It was recent. The screws shone faintly. I smiled. So not footsteps, but transmission, not haunting, but engineering. The 5 steps, the pause, the resonance gathering near the stairwell. It was a signal, crafted, precise, deliberate. But for whom? And why only at 11 minutes past midnight? I traced the conduit with my eyes. It extended toward the rear wall, toward the yard. Beyond that yard stood another building. Empty, Mrs. Whitmore had said. Empty houses, I reflected, are rarely empty of purpose. That evening, as the tenants resumed their uneasy vigil, I said nothing of my discovery. Instead, I returned quietly to the cellar and waited beside the beam. At 11 minutes past midnight, the sound came again. 5 measured vibrations, a pause after the 3rd, and as they reverberated through the wood, I placed my hand upon the conduit. It trembled. not with ghostly force, with current, some unknown, somewhere beyond these walls, was sending a message, and someone within this house was meant to receive it. Chapter 3. The geometry of sound. The following morning, I measured the corridor from end to stairwell with the care one might give to a chessboard upon which a subtle game has already begun. Most people look at a hallway and see only a passage between rooms. I looked and saw structure, a narrow chamber of contained air, a suspended plane of oak laid over cavities, a vertical shaft in the stairwell rising like a column. In such spaces sound is not merely heard, it is directed. The corridor's wallpaper, once cream, had faded to a fatigued yellow that bore the faint memory of floral patterning. The runner carpet lay thin along the center seam, its fibers worn by decades of discreet traffic. Beneath it, the boards were old oak, well seasoned, each plank slightly uneven from years of expansion and contraction. I walked the length slowly, measuring with my stride, noting the faint incline that ran from the far end toward the stairs. It was not visible to the eye but perceptible underfoot, a subtle decline that would encourage vibration to drift toward the stairwell. The stairwell itself was narrow and enclosed on three sides, its walls paneled in dark wood that had been polished until it possessed a faint sheen. When I stood at its mouth and spoke softly, my voice returned to me, altered, compressed, as though shaped by a throat. That was the word that came to me, a throat, for echo's sound that entered it was gathered, focused and released upward. One need not traverse the hallway to be heard within it. I knelt near the fifth plank from Mrs. Whitmore's door, as I had observed the previous evening. I tapped with my cane. The note rang sharper there. Not louder, sharper, a clean, resonant tone, unlike the muted response of the neighboring boards. I tapped again, varying the pressure. The third tap produced a faint metallic sympathy beneath the wood. Ah, there are moments in investigation when the mind experiences a small, precise pleasure, not of triumph, but of confirmation. The board did not merely cover empty space. It concealed something that responded to vibration. Mrs. Whitmore, I called gently. She emerged from her room, hands clasped. Yes, Mr. Poirot? Has this board ever been lifted? Not to my knowledge. The carpet has been replaced twice in my time, but the floor beneath has remained untouched. And you have no recollection of workmen in the cellar below this point? None whatsoever. Her certainty appeared genuine. Yet the metallic echo persisted beneath my taps. I asked permission to lift a corner of the runner. With careful fingers I folded it back. The oak beneath bore the polish of age, but also, faintly visible, the small circular impressions of screws that were newer than their surroundings. They had been countersunk with care, then stained to match, recently disturbed. I said nothing instead. I continued my survey, measuring the entire corridor. From the stairhead to the end wall there were 14 boards of consistent width. The fifth lay precisely where Mrs. Latham had recalled Mr. Mowbray's former room to have been. The fifth from the stairs. Coincidence may be charming in literature. In life, it is often manufactured. As I straightened, Miss Clara Hastings approached, her expression both anxious and curious. You have discovered something. I have discovered, I replied. That sound behaves according to geometry. When space narrows, vibration concentrates. When wood is hollowed, resonance sharpens. Fear is often persuaded by acoustics rather than evidence. She looked toward the staircase uneasily, but we all heard it. It passed us. You heard it travel, I corrected gently. Travel does not require feet. Her brow furrowed as she attempted to reconcile sensation with reason. I requested to examine the cellar once more. The access panel lay behind stacked trunks. With Mrs. Whitmore's assistance, we cleared a path. The panel itself was secured by 2 small screws, also recent. When I removed it, a stale breath of air escaped from the crawl space beneath the floor. I descended carefully, candle in hand. The cavity was larger than I had anticipated, nearly 3 feet in height, extending the full length of the corridor above. Wooden joists ran parallel, and between them, shadows lay thick, and there, affixed neatly along the beam corresponding to the fifth plank, ran the narrow metal conduit I had detected the previous evening. It was secured with small brackets and disappeared toward the stairwell. I crouched and examined it closely. It was not a crude addition, but a precise one, installed with deliberation and skill. Where it reached the stairwell's base, it connected to a small mechanical device, no larger than a cigar box. The device was mounted discreetly, painted dark to merge with shadow. I did not touch it immediately. Instead, I studied its arrangement. A thin rod extended upward through a minute, aperture bored into the underside of the fifth plank. The hole was invisible from above, concealed beneath the carpet's weave. When activated, the rod would press upward against the board, producing the impression of weight, a step 5 rods, 5 planks. A pause after the third, as Miss Hastings had described. Ingenious, the device was not intended to mimic a person perfectly. It was intended to evoke the suggestion of one. The boards would depress sequentially, creating vibration that traveled toward the stairwell, where the enclosed space would gather and amplify it. No shadow was required, no body necessary. Only resonance. I replaced the panel carefully and ascended. Mrs. Whitmore awaited me with apprehension. "Well, the house," I said calmly, "has been given a voice." She stared. "Do not be alarmed, the voice is mechanical." Her hand flew to her throat. "Mechanical. But who?" "That," I replied, "is the more interesting question." The installation required time, access, and technical knowledge. It had not been accomplished by accident, nor had it been constructed merely to frighten. Its precision suggested communication, a code, 5 pulses. Pause after 3, at 11 minutes past midnight. A time unlikely to be chosen for mere mischief. I returned upstairs and walked once more to the stairhead. I closed my eyes and imagined the sequence. Vibration rising through oak, gathering in the stairwell, dispersing along walls. If one were in a particular room, perhaps near the landing, the sound might be clearer, more distinct. "Mr. Hale," I said when the young medical student appeared in the hallway, "in which room do you reside?" "Second door from the stairs," he replied. "And you have heard nothing?" "Nothing. Your studies, are they kept late?" "Occasionally." "And last evening at 11 minutes past midnight, I was reading and heard nothing." Number interesting. I turned instead to Miss Eleanor Graves, whose room lay at the corridor's far end. "And you, Miss Graves, where were you last night?" "In my room." "Awake?" "Yes." "And you heard the steps?" "I did." Clearly she paused, only briefly, clearly enough. "Did they seem distant or near?" She regarded me with cool composure. "Near." The stairwell gathered sound, but the fifth plank lay closer to her room than to the others. If the device were transmitting vibration, her position would allow the clearest reception. I allowed the word to rest quietly in my thoughts. Later that afternoon, I examined the yard behind the house. The narrow strip of ground separated Ashbury Crescent from the adjacent building, which stood shuttered and apparently unoccupied. Its windows were boarded, its door secured with a heavy lock, yet I noticed faint scuff marks near the rear entrance, recent and regular. Empty houses, as I had reflected, are rarely empty of purpose. The conduit beneath the floor ran toward the rear wall. From there it could easily pass through brick into the adjoining structure. Someone in that building could activate the device without entering Mrs. Whitmore's house, which meant the signal was intended for someone within. But who and why 5 pulses? 5 may denote a room, a number, a letter. The pause after 3 might indicate separation, 3 and 2, 3, 2, perhaps a date or an instruction. I returned to the corridor as evening approached. The tenants moved about with heightened awareness. Fear had acquired routine. They anticipated it, almost as one anticipates a train's arrival. It struck me then that terror, when punctual, loses some of its power, it becomes expectation, and expectation breeds interpretation. The house did not generate fear by chance. It cultivated it by design. At 5 minutes to midnight, I stationed myself again in the cellar, this time beside the mechanical device, candle extinguished. I waited in darkness. The minute hand advanced, and then a faint click. The rods moved in sequence. 1, 2, 3, pause 4, 5. The vibration passed upward through the beams. But here, in the crawl space, I heard something more. A second, softer click, not within the device itself, but beyond the rear wall. A return, a response. The signal was not solitary. It was part of an exchange. Someone beyond the wall acknowledged the 5 pulses. The geometry of sound had revealed its architecture. Now the human geometry must be uncovered. The arrangement of motives, relationships, and secrets that required such clandestine communication. I remained crouched in darkness long after the final vibration had faded. The house had spoken, and I had begun to understand its language. But language implies conversation, and conversation implies 2 participants. The next task would be to discover both. For in matters of sound, as in matters of conscience, resonance occurs only when something answers back. Chapter 4. The residence, no mystery, exists in isolation. A house may carry sound, but it is people who carry secrets. Once I had understood the geometry of the corridor, it became necessary to study the geometry of those who inhabited it. There were 6 lodgers presently in residence. Mr. Caleb Dunn, a clerk employed at a shipping office near Holborn, was a thin young man with restless fingers and a complexion that suggested insufficient sunlight. His hair lay flat against his skull, as though pressed there by constant worry. He possessed the habit of glancing toward the staircase when spoken to, as if expecting interruption. Miss Clara Hastings, the music teacher, had quiet eyes and a composed manner. Her dark hair was drawn back neatly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the gentle modulation of one accustomed to instructing children in scales and rhythm. She had the stillness of someone who listens more than she speaks. Mr. Harold Finch, retired watchmaker, maintained a narrow dignity. He wore a waistcoat, even at breakfast, and carried in his breast pocket a small polishing cloth for his spectacles. His fingers were steady, precise, the hands of a man long accustomed to gears and springs. Mrs. Beatrice Latham, recently widowed, occupied the front room. She dressed always in muted grey and black, though not in ostentatious mourning. Her expression bore the permanent softness of someone who has endured disappointment without protest. Thomas Bell, a law student, possessed the alert, calculating gaze of youth determined to ascend. His posture was upright, his responses measured, as though each statement might be entered into record. Finally, Edward Hale, journalist, scarcely more than 25, with ink-stained cuffs and an air of perpetual observation. His questions were quick, his smile quicker. 6 residents, 6 possible recipients of a message sent nightly at 11 minutes past midnight. He assembled them that afternoon in the modest sitting room. The fire burned low. Mrs. Whitmore hovered near the door, but did not join us. You have all denied participation in the nightly phenomenon. I began calmly. I do not accuse you of fabrication. I merely observe that denial is not evidence. Mr. Dunn shifted in his chair. It is absurd, he said, a trick of the building. And yet, I replied gently, you flinched when I mentioned 11. His eyes widened momentarily before narrowing. Did I? You did. He swallowed. 11 is a significant hour for anyone who keeps accounts. The day closes. Errors surface. Ah, I said, errors. Miss Reeves sat very still, too still. Her attention did not wander. It fixed itself upon my watch chain as though measuring its swing. Mr. Finch removed his spectacles and polished them slowly. Time, he remarked, is seldom the culprit. It is the human use of time that creates difficulty. A philosophical watchmaker, I observed. He inclined his head slightly. Mrs. Grant folded her hands in her lap. I have heard the steps only once, she said softly. They did not frighten me. Grief is louder. A perceptive statement, and perhaps a truthful one. Thomas Bell leaned forward. With respect, sir, if you suspect one of us, it would be efficient to say so. I suspect, I replied. That someone within this house is meant to hear something. That is not the same as suspecting guilt. Woodward Hale smiled faintly. A signal, perhaps. I turned my gaze toward him. Why do you say that? Because repetition implies intention, and intention implies message. He spoke lightly, but his fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. Indeed, I said, and messages are rarely sent without recipients. Silence settled. I rose and approached the hallway rack, where the lodger's shoes were kept. It is a simple thing, footwear, yet it bears witness to habit and temperament more reliably than speech. There were polished leather brogues, Dunn's no doubt, carefully maintained but worn thin at the outer edges, suggesting nervous pacing, a pair of narrow-heeled shoes, Miss Reeves's soles intact, rarely hurried. Mr. Finch's shoes were impeccable, their stitching maintained, heels evenly worn. Mrs. Grant's boots showed little wear. She moved sparingly. Thomas Hale's shoes bore the scuff of city pavements. Forward-driven, decisive, Edward Hale's were less formal, practical, with faint ink stains near the laces, an absent-minded habit. And there, slightly apart, stood a pair of rubber-tipped boots. They were heavier, utilitarian, designed for quiet movement. Their soles bore recent traces of clay, not the fine dust of London streets, but coarser earth. "Whose are these?" I asked. A brief pause. "They are mine," said Mr. Dunn after a moment. "You are a clerk, yes, and clerks require boots suited for damp yards. I visit the docks occasionally." "Recently," he hesitated, "last week." I examined the soles more closely. The clay was still faintly moist in its crevices. "Curious," I murmured. I turned back to the group. "I should like each of you to walk the corridor." Mr. Reed's brows lifted. "Walk?" "Yes, from the stairhead to the end window naturally." Mr. Finch gave a small, amused exhale. "You propose to measure our strides." "I propose to observe them." One by one they complied. Dunn walked first. His steps were uneven, slightly hurried, as though anticipating rebuke. His right foot struck more heavily than his left. There was no rhythm of 3, pause, 2. Miss Reeves moved with measured grace. Her steps were light, almost inaudible, evenly spaced. Mr. Finch walked with extraordinary regularity, each step identical to the last, heel and toe aligned precisely. I watched him closely. 5 steps from stairhead to the position of the 5th plank. Pause. He turned, puzzled. "Habit," he explained calmly. "When measuring distance, I count in 5s. "Ah." Mrs. Grant's movement was slow, unhurried, without pattern. Thomas Bell strode forward decisively. His pace, quick, confident. Edward Hale walked last. His steps were thoughtful, variable, as though composing an article in his mind. None reproduced the exact cadence of the mechanical pulses. But that was not my purpose. I sought not mimicry, but familiarity. "Thank you," I said. As they dispersed, I addressed Mr. Finch quietly. "You have lived here how long?" 3 years. "And before that?" He smiled faintly. 40 years in watchmaking. A profession of precision, yes, and of small devices, certainly. "You appreciate mechanisms." "I do." Our eyes met. "You would recognize one," I said softly, "if it were concealed beneath a floor." His expression did not change, but his fingers tightened slightly around his polishing cloth. "I imagine I would," he replied. "And you have not inspected the cellar recently?" I inclined my head. Later, I found Miss Reeves alone in the sitting room, adjusting sheet music in a leather folder. "You keep tempo," I remarked. "It is essential." "And the pause after the 3rd beat, what does it suggest?" She looked at me sharply. "In music, it suggests emphasis. Or division." "Yes." 3 and 2. She hesitated, perhaps. "And what might 3 and 2 signify?" Her gaze drifted briefly toward the corridor. "It depends on the composition." When she left, I considered her response carefully. Composers understand pattern. They also understand concealment within pattern. That evening, I stationed myself once more in the cellar. At 11 minutes past midnight, the 5 pulses came precise, unwavering, and once again, after the 5th, there was a faint answering click from beyond the rear wall. 2 participants. Zone transmitter within the adjacent building. 1 recipient within this house. I returned upstairs immediately. The corridor was quiet. All doors closed, but from behind one door, the 5th from the stairs, I detected the faintest scrape, as of furniture moved quickly back into place. The 5th from the stairs, formerly Mr. Mowbray's room, now occupied by Mr. Harold Finch, the retired watchmaker. Footwear may confess what lips conceal, but so may silence. And silence in that moment weighed heavier than any step. Chapter 5. Borrowed steps. That evening, I conducted a small experiment. It is often unwise to accuse before one has demonstrated. Accusation invites resistance. Demonstration invites thought. I therefore requested, with courtesy and apparent innocence, that each lodger walk the corridor in turn while I remained within Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom, her door slightly ajar, her lamp turned low. From that vantage, I would hear what she heard. The corridor beyond lay in dim light, its length narrowing toward the stairwell like a funnel. I positioned myself precisely where Mrs. Whitmore claimed the midnight procession passed her door. I wished to know whether the illusion depended upon distance or upon structure. "Mr. Dunn," I called softly. "If you please," he complied, somewhat reluctantly. His shoes struck the runner with uncertain rhythm. A step, a faint drag. Another step too quick. From within the room, the sound lost shape as it approached the stairhead. It scattered, irregular and human. "No," I murmured. "That will do." Miss Clara Hastings followed. Her tread was lighter, evenly spaced. Yet even her disciplined movement produced minor variations. The subtle adjustment of weight at the turn, the minute hesitation before reversal. The echo altered as she passed the 5th plank. It did not gather there. Mr. Harold Finch walked next. His steps were admirably measured. Heel, toe, even as clockwork. But when he crossed the corridor fully, the sound traveled differently. It broadened and softened, as though unwilling to confine itself to one location. It did not strike with the clean resonance I had heard. At 11 minutes past midnight, Mrs. Beatrice Latham walked slowly, the boards responding with faint complaint beneath her weight. Thomas Bell strode with legal impatience. Edward Hale moved thoughtfully, pausing once to peer at the wallpaper, as though it might yield an anecdote. None matched the peculiar cadence of the midnight visitor. The difference was subtle but decisive. When the mechanical pulses occurred, the sound did not travel organically from stair to wall. It emerged with uniform clarity from a specific point, then propagated outward. It was not a journey, it was an event. I emerged from Mrs. Whitmore's room and addressed Mr. Finch directly. "One more request, if you would be so kind." He regarded me with polite reserve. "Certainly. Walk only halfway down the corridor, to the point before the 5th plank, and then return. Do not cross it." He paused, just perceptibly. "Very well." He proceeded from the stairhead, counting perhaps unconsciously. 1, 2, 3, 4. At the 4th board he turned and retraced his steps. From within Mrs. Whitmore's room the effect was unmistakable. The echo shifted strangely, as though reluctant to follow him. It did not gather near the 5th plank. It did not sharpen. Instead, it dispersed weakly toward the stairwell. "Again," I said quietly. He complied without protest. Once more the sound refused to bloom. I stepped into the corridor. "You see," I said conversationally, "it is not the tread alone that matters. It is the place upon which it falls." Mr. Reed frowned. "You mean the board itself determines the character of the sound?" "Precisely. A particular plank produces a particular resonance. Strike it consistently, and the effect may be replicated." Edward Hale's eyes brightened. "So the midnight visitor always treads the same path?" "The midnight visitor," I corrected gently, "does not tread at all." A silence followed Mrs. Whitmore clasped her hands. "You mean there is no one walking?" "There is sound," I replied, "but not movement. The steps possess a uniform clarity as though delivered upon the same precise board each night." Mr. Dunn swallowed. "That is impossible." "On the contrary," I said softly, "it is mechanical." Mr. Finch's gaze remained steady, yet his posture had altered slightly. His shoulders, once relaxed, now carried a faint tension. I continued calmly. "The 5 pulses we hear are not footsteps wandering, they are footsteps positioned. Someone has borrowed the idea of movement without undertaking the journey." Thomas Bell leaned forward. "To what end?" "To communicate," I answered. Miss Reeves's fingers tightened around the edge of a chair. "A signal," Edward Hale suggested. "Yes, a signal structured in sound." Mrs. Grant looked from face to face, confusion mingled with dawning comprehension. "But for whom?" "That," I replied, "is the interesting question." I dismissed them for the evening with assurances that no danger threatened their safety. Fear diminishes when furnished with explanation, yet explanation incomplete can create a new anxiety. When the corridor emptied, I remained with Mr. Finch. "You have lived in the 5th room from the stairs for 3 years, I said mildly. "I have. You are familiar with the character of its floorboards. Any attentive resident would be. And you appreciate the precision required to produce consistent intervals." He adjusted his spectacles. "As a watchmaker?" "Yes." I inclined my head. "Tell me, Mr. Finch, did you know the gentleman who occupied that room before you?" "Mr. Mowbray." He hesitated, slightly, and he kept irregular hours, walked late. 5 steps from the stairhead to his door. So I believe, and his death, unfortunate. Natural. That was the conclusion. "Yours?" He met my gaze. "Yes." The word hung between us, not false perhaps, but incomplete. I thanked him and allowed him to withdraw. Left alone in the corridor, I knelt once more by the 5th plank. I pressed gently upon it with my palm. The resonance responded immediately, a faint, hollow reply beneath. Borrowed steps. The brilliance of the scheme lay not merely in concealment, but in psychology. The human mind completes patterns. Provide 5 evenly spaced impacts and the listener supplies the walker. Add a pause after the 3rd, and intention is inferred. But why 5, 3, and 2, a division? Or perhaps a code, the 5th room, if the signal originated in the adjacent building, and if the recipient resided in the 5th room, then the pulses might serve as notification, not haunting, but appointment. 11 minutes past midnight, a precise hour, not midnight exactly, but 11 minutes after. Why 11? I withdrew my watch and examined it thoughtfully. In telegraph code, 5 pulses may signify a letter, but the pause alters, meaning 3 and 2. Could it represent a date? The 3rd of February, or perhaps an instruction, 3rd shelf, 2nd drawer, or, more simply, the 5th occupant. If one numbered the rooms from the stairhead, the 5th was Mr. Finch's coincidence becomes improbable when repetition is exact. At 5 minutes to midnight, I descended once more to the cellar. I positioned myself beside the device and waited. The click came precisely on time. 1 rod lifted, 2, 3, pause, 4, 5. The sequence was immaculate. But tonight I noticed something new. After the 5th pulse, there was a slight delay, longer than before, and then a second, softer vibration traveled back along the conduit, a reply. It did not originate in the adjacent building, it originated above, from the 5th room. I closed my eyes briefly, so the signal was not merely sent outward, it was acknowledged inward. Someone in this house responded. Someone had borrowed the idea of movement without undertaking the journey, but now the journey would be mine, for signals require secrecy only when their purpose cannot endure daylight. And daylight, I resolved, would soon be invited into Ashbury Crescent. Chapter 6. The stairwell's secret in the afternoon. I inspected the stairwell more thoroughly. It is a common error in investigation to become enamored of the most dramatic element. The corridor, with its suggestion of invisible passage, had captivated the imagination of the household. All eyes had turned toward its length each night, awaiting the procession that never appeared. Yet the corridor, I began to suspect, was not the actor, but the instrument. The true performance space lay elsewhere. The stairwell rose tightly between paneled walls, its banister polished by decades of hands, ascending and descending in ordinary purpose. Light from the upper landing filtered downward in a pale shaft, while the lower hall remained in shadow. It was precisely the sort of architectural feature that encourages sound to behave in ways both deceptive and persuasive. I stood upon the first stair and listened, not to noise. There was none, but to the character of the space itself. A staircase compresses air. It forms a column through which vibration travels upward with peculiar clarity. A whisper uttered at its base may appear to originate halfway along its height. A step struck sharply upon its wood may echo not from beneath the foot, but from the landing above. I descended slowly, examining the banister posts, the inner molding, the narrow seam where wall met stair. There, just beneath the banister rail and close to the wall, at ankle height, I observed faint scuff marks. They were not recent enough to glisten, yet not old enough to have faded into anonymity. The marks were narrow, horizontal, and repeated at roughly equal intervals. I crouched. Partially concealed by shadow, affixed along the interior molding, ran a slender strip of wood, scarcely wider than a finger. It blended expertly with the darker grain of the banister, its edges smoothed, its nails set flush and stained to match. I touched it lightly with my fingertips hollow. Not empty entirely, but hollowed. I rose, and with the heel of my shoe, struck it gently. The sound that emerged was unmistakable, a clean, resonant report, identical in timbre to the step heard at 11 minutes past midnight. I struck again, spacing the impacts carefully. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 4. It gathered at the fifth plank with obedient precision and then dispersed, creating the illusion of passage along the corridor's length. The visitor, then, was an illusion, but an engineered one. One need only stand upon the first stair, hidden from the corridor's sightline, and tap in measured intervals. The person performing the act would remain invisible from every door. Those within the rooms would hear the sound as though it moved past them. The haunting could be scheduled because it was rehearsed. I allowed myself a small, satisfied nod. The mechanical device beneath the floor had not been necessary to create the illusion. It had been an enhancement, perhaps even a contingency, but the primary instrument was here, in the stairwell, simple and elegant. A watchmaker would appreciate such economy. Yet I did not indulge in premature certainty. An investigator must test even what appears obvious. I requested Mrs. Whitmore to accompany me to her bedroom and close the door. Then, positioning myself upon the first stair, concealed from her view, I struck the strip in the familiar pattern. From within the room she called out, breathless, "It is here, passing," precisely as I had anticipated. When I joined her moments later, she stared at me with mingled relief and astonishment. "You were on the stairs?" "Yes," but it sounded as though it came along the corridor. Because the corridor is obedient, it carries what it is given. She sank into a chair. "Then there is no ghost." "There is intention," I said gently. "And intention is more troubling than any ghost. For intention implies purpose, and purpose implies motive." I examined the strip more closely. It had not been affixed carelessly. The nails were evenly spaced. The wood had been hollowed with patience, leaving just enough thickness to produce resonance without splintering. The placement at ankle height was deliberate. The heel of a shoe could strike it naturally without requiring awkward movement. Whoever installed it understood both sound and subtlety. I straightened and considered the sightline from the corridor. If one stood upon the first stair slightly turned inward, one would be invisible from every bedroom door. Even if a door were opened suddenly, the person could ascend a step or two, appearing to have merely paused upon the stairs. Invisible performer, audible effect, ingenious. But why repeat it nightly? Repetition transforms curiosity into fear. Fear drives behavior. Behavior may be manipulated. The question, therefore, was not merely who could create the sound, but who benefited from its persistence. I summoned the residents one by one to observe the stairwell. Mr. Caleb Dunn arrived first. His gaze darted nervously as I indicated the strip of wood. "You have noticed this before?" I asked. "No," he replied quickly, too quickly. "I never look at the molding, yet you descend these stairs daily." "Yes, but," he faltered. I watched him carefully. His boots, the rubber, tipped pair, bore faint impressions along their heels that matched the scuff marks upon the strip. "Your footwear," I said mildly, "would produce a clean sound if struck here." He stiffened. I did not accuse," I interrupted gently. "I observe only that your boots are suited to damp yards and silent movement." He swallowed. "I visit the docks, that is all." Indeed, when he left, his composure was diminished. Miss Clara Hastings followed. She examined the strip thoughtfully. "In music," she said quietly, "a hollow surface produces a purer tone." "Just so," I replied. "You believe someone stands here each night?" "I believe someone could." "And that the corridor completes the illusion?" "Yes." Her expression was unreadable. "It is clever." "Fairy." Mr. Harold Finch came next. He crouched without prompting, inspecting the strip with professional interest. "A fine piece of work," he murmured. "You admire it. It is efficient. Have you noticed it before?" "I cannot say that I have, yet you appreciate craftsmanship." "I do. And you have lived here 3 years." "Yes. Long enough to become familiar with the stairwell's character." He rose slowly. "Are you suggesting I installed it?" "I suggest nothing," I said calmly. "I seek only understanding." His gaze held mine. "Understanding is rarely comfortable." "No," I agreed, "but it is necessary." When he departed, I felt certain of one thing. He was not surprised. Thomas Bell examined the strip with analytical detachment. "It would take little effort to produce the illusion," he observed. "True. And if one wished to unsettle the household?" "Yes. Or to compel someone to leave." An astute remark. "Indeed," I said. Didwood Hale approached last. He studied the strip briefly, then glanced at me with a faint smile. "You have found your ghost." "I have found its throat," I replied. "And now?" "Now I must discover why it speaks." He nodded thoughtfully. As the afternoon light faded, I returned alone to the stairwell. I struck the strip once more softly and listened to the corridor respond. The effect was precise, obedient, almost eager. The illusion did not require extraordinary machinery. It required rehearsal, 5 strikes, pause after the third, 11 minutes past midnight. The choice of hour remained curious. Why not midnight precisely? Why not a random time? 11 minutes past suggests synchronization, perhaps with another clock, a watchmaker's clock, or a signal agreed upon. I descended to the cellar once more to examine the conduit. It was still present, still capable of transmitting vibration, yet now I perceived its purpose differently. It was not the primary source of the sound. It was a secondary channel, a confirmation. The stairwell produced the illusion within the house. The conduit transmitted acknowledgement beyond it, 2 mechanisms working in harmony. Summonon stood upon the first stair each night, striking the hollow strip in measured intervals. The corridor projected the steps. The conduit carried the vibration outward, and somewhere beyond the rear wall someone listened. A rendezvous conducted in resonance. I extinguished the cellar light and stood in darkness, considering the haunting could be scheduled because it was rehearsed. The illusion could persist because it was believed, but belief is fragile once its mechanism is exposed. The next midnight would not belong to the unseen performer, it would belong to me. For when a house speaks on command, it reveals more than intended, and I intended to hear everything. Chapter 7. Prophet in panic, the notion that a ghost might be deliberately cultivated as one tends a garden struck me, I confess, as both grotesque and curiously practical. Yet human ingenuity, when allied with financial strain, has been known to flower in unlikely soil. The events of the previous evening had set my thoughts in motion. By morning they had arranged themselves in a neat procession, each following the other with admirable obedience. Mrs. Whitmore received me in her small morning room, where the curtains were half drawn against a pale winter light. She looked diminished. The proud severity with which she had once presided over her lodging-house had softened into anxiety. "Two more, Mr. Poirot," she said, clasping her hands so tightly that the knuckles showed white. "Miss Fletcher and Mr. Pritchard, they have both given notice. They say they cannot endure another night of it." "Of what precisely, madam?" I inquired gently. "Of the disturbances, the footsteps, the dreadful knocking on the walls, and," she lowered her voice, "the weeping. Miss Fletcher swears she heard weeping outside her door at 3 in the morning." I inclined my head. "And these rooms, they are near to the staircase?" "Yes, the entire east corridor has become a place of terror after dark." She rose and began to pace. "I have done everything. I have searched for loose shutters, for faulty pipes, for boys in the street playing tricks. There is nothing. And now I am ruined. If this continues, the house will empty itself." "Ruined," I echoed. "My income depends upon full occupancy. The mortgage is not a forgiving master, Mr. Poirot." I watched her with interest. Fear had indeed begun to do its work. 2 lodgers gone, more threatening to follow. Panic, once established, is an excellent propagator. It multiplies in the mind more rapidly than any bacterium. "And Mr. Edward Hale?" I asked with casual precision. "Has he expressed alarm?" She hesitated. "He complains, certainly loudly, but he has not given notice." "Ah, on the contrary," she continued. "He mentioned only yesterday that, should the house become less crowded, he might consider leasing the room opposite his own for storage. He says he needs space for his business materials." "And this business," I said, "is not flourishing." She gave a short, weary laugh. "He is forever on the brink of catastrophe, at least, so he tells us." I folded my hands and regarded the fire. The flame flickered, the coals settled with a faint sigh. A haunting that empties rooms may enrich the patient observer. Fear, I reflected, can indeed be rented out like a chamber. "Permit me, madam," I said, rising, "to examine the east corridor once more. There are certain details which interest me profoundly." The corridor in question was narrow, its carpet worn by decades of respectable footsteps. The walls bore framed engravings of landscapes, peaceful scenes that now seemed incongruously calm. Edward Hale's room stood nearest the staircase. Beyond it lay the chambers of Miss Fletcher and Mr. Pritchard, soon to be vacated. I paused outside Hale's door. From within came the faint scrape of furniture. I knocked. He opened promptly. Edward Hale was a young man of restless energy. His hair, perpetually in need of discipline, curled rebelliously above a narrow brow. His eyes were sharp and mobile. "Mr. Poirot," he said, forcing a smile. "Come to investigate the spirits?" "I come," I replied, "to converse with the living." He stepped aside. The room was tidy but sparse. A small desk stood near the window. Papers were arranged in careful stacks. A trunk lay open against the far wall. "You are preparing for travel?" I asked. "Considering it," he answered. "If this madness continues, I shall be compelled to leave. No man can work amidst constant hysteria." "You have not given notice." He shrugged. "I am undecided." "And yet," I said lightly, "you have inquired about leasing additional space." He stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Only in the event that rooms become available. It would reduce my expenses if I could negotiate a lower rate for more space." "Ah, you see opportunity in adversity." "Anyone with sense does." I walked to the window and looked down upon the quiet street. "Tell me, Mr. Hale, on the night when Miss Fletcher heard weeping, where were you?" "In my room asleep, I imagine." "Alone?" He gave a short laugh. "I have no accomplice in slumber, Mr. Poirot, indeed." I examined the door. Its lower edge bore a faint mark. an abrasion in the wood, recent and clean. "You move your furniture frequently?" I asked. "Sometimes." "Why?" "For comfort." He did not answer. That evening, I stationed myself discreetly at the foot of the staircase. The house had retired early, dread hasten's bedtime. The corridor above lay in darkness save for a single lamp. Midnight passed without incident. At 11 minutes past midnight, a sound emerged, a dull, rhythmic thudding, faint yet deliberate. It echoed along the corridor. A door creaked open. A whisper of alarm followed. I ascended quietly, my tread as soft as the shadow of a cat. The sound ceased. Outside Hale's room, I paused. The corridor was silent now, yet the air seemed charged with expectation. Suddenly, from the far end, there came a low, wavering moan, so human in its cadence that it chilled even my disciplined mind. A door slammed. Someone gasped. I moved swiftly to Hale's door and knocked sharply. The moaning stopped at once. "Mr. Hale," I called, "pray open." There was a delay, a fraction too long. At last he appeared, pale but composed. "What is it?" "You heard nothing." He frowned. "Only the usual infernal nonsense." "May I?" Without waiting for consent, I stepped inside. The room appeared undisturbed. Yet near the trunk, I observed a length of thin cord coiled carelessly upon the floor. It trailed toward the door. "What is this?" I asked mildly. "A packing cord." I bent and examined it. The end bore frayed fibers, recently cut. "And this abrasion on your door," I continued. "It corresponds precisely to the height of this cord." His eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I accuse no one," I replied calmly. "I merely observe that a cord passed beneath a door may be attached to an object in the corridor. When pulled, it produces a most mysterious knocking, especially if weighted appropriately." His silence was eloquent. "And as for the moaning," I went on, "one might employ a simple instrument, a small metal tube perhaps, to carry the voice beyond the door, distorting it, rendering it unrecognizable." "You are inventing fantasies," he said sharply. "On the contrary, I am dispelling them." I crossed to the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside lay, among folded garments, a curious apparatus, a narrow length of piping, jointed, and a small mallet, padded with cloth. "For business materials," I suggested. His composure fractured. "You cannot prove." "My dear Mr. Hale," I interrupted gently, "proof is a matter of patience." "But motive?" Motive is already clear. 2 lodgers depart, their rooms fall vacant. You negotiate for additional space at reduced cost. You alone reside nearest the stairs, affording both opportunity and escape. You cultivate fear as another man cultivates flowers. He turned away, shoulders rigid. "Financial hardship," I continued, not unkindly, "is a stern tutor. But to profit from panic, to prey upon the anxieties of honest people, this is unworthy." "You do not understand," he burst out. "I am drowning, my creditors, my work. No one gives a man a chance," I thought. "If a few left, if rents fell, I might survive." "At the expense of others' peace," I said quietly. He sank into a chair, covering his face. The following morning, I met Mrs. Whitmore once more. Edward Hale, chastened and pale, stood beside me. "He has a confession to make," I said. "There is no ghost, only my foolishness." Mrs. Whitmore stared in disbelief, then indignation, and finally weary relief. "You frightened them deliberately," she demanded. "I did." Tears sprang to her eyes, not of fear, but of anger. "You have damaged my house, my reputation." "I shall repair what I can," he said. I inclined my head. "Restitution may yet restore confidence. The lodgers must be informed, calmly and clearly, that the disturbances were of human origin and have ceased." Mrs. Whitmore straightened. "They shall know." When we were alone, Edward Hale looked at me with a mixture of resentment and gratitude. "You could have exposed me publicly." "I have exposed you sufficiently." I replied. The law need not intervene when conscience is prepared to do its work. And if it had not been, then, monsieur, I said softly, we should have had a different conversation. He nodded. As I stepped into the crisp morning air, I reflected upon the curious economy of fear. It is an intangible commodity, yet it commands a high price. In that modest lodging house, panic had threatened to become a profitable enterprise. Rooms would empty, rents would fall, advantage would accrue to the architect of unrest. Opportunity and proximity are intimate companions. A man nearest the staircase may also be nearest temptation, but in the end, reason prevailed over superstition. The ghost dissolved, the house reclaimed its dignity. And I, Hercule Poirot, was reminded once more that the most dangerous spectres are not those that rattle chains in the night, but those that whisper of easy gain in the anxious heart of man. Chapter 8. The weight of habitual gilt morning light filtered weakly through the frosted glass above the stairwell, laying a pale ribbon across the worn banister. The house was quieter than usual, not with the natural quiet of contentment, but with the restrained stillness of people who wait for reassurance. Fear had not yet departed. It lingered in glances, in the way doors were shut with care, in the deliberate avoidance of the east corridor after dusk. Edward Hale stood near the foot of the staircase when I summoned the residents to gather. His posture was controlled, but control is not composure. There is a difference. Control is stiff, composure is fluid. He possessed the former. Mrs. Whitmore positioned herself with rigid dignity beside the umbrella stand. Miss Fletcher clutched her handbag, as though prepared to flee at any renewed disturbance. Mr. Pritchard watched with skeptical patience, yet I detected the faint tightening around his eyes, the residue of several sleepless nights. It was not sufficient that Mr. Hale had confessed to me privately. Fear, once introduced, must be dismantled publicly. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, we shall conduct a small experiment. It will require patience, observation, and a willingness to reconsider what we have heard. I turned to Bell. Mr. Hale, if you would ascend the staircase as you ordinarily would. He obliged at once. His tread was light, almost elegant. The boards emitted the modest creaks one expects from an old house, but nothing alarming. Miss Fletcher frowned. That is not it, she said. The sound was deliberate, hollow, as though someone paused to listen. Exactly, I replied. Now we shall alter only one element. From the hallway rack, I retrieved the pair of rubber-tipped boots discovered earlier behind the stack of coal scuttles. They were sturdy, practical, and, most importantly, distinctive. You have stated these are not yours, I said to Bell. They are not, he answered quickly. And yet they were hidden in a cupboard accessible only to residents. He said nothing. Pray put them on. A moment's hesitation, then compliance. The transformation was immediate. He placed one foot upon the first stair tap. The sound was not loud. It did not crash or echo dramatically. It was controlled, muted, but resonant. The rubber heel struck the narrow central strip of wood, compressing slightly before releasing with a contained thud that traveled through the enclosed stairwell like a pulse tap. Miss Fletcher inhaled sharply tap. He reached the landing and paused, precisely as described in every account of the nightly disturbances. The air itself seemed to tighten. That is it, Mr. Pritchard said slowly, that very rhythm. I gestured for Bell to descend. The tapping followed him downward, steady and measured. When he stood before us again, I knelt and examined the sole of the boot. Near its outer edge lay a faint indentation, barely perceptible unless one knew to look. I moved to the second stair from the landing. A narrow scuff marred the varnish, fresh, pale against the darker wood. I aligned the boot with the mark. The match was exact. Habitual guilt, I said, rising, leaves impressions, both upon conscience and upon oak. Mrs. Whitmore pressed her hand to her chest. You did this night after night. Hale's composure wavered. Yes. Not once, I continued calmly, but repeatedly. The first evening may have been experimentation. The second, rehearsal. By the third, it had become method. Hale's eyes flickered with reluctant acknowledgement. You waited, I said, turning to him. Until the house settled. You listened for silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of sleep. Then you stepped into the corridor, just beyond sight. You timed the intervals. You created rhythm. He swallowed. The boards creaked too unpredictably at first. "Ah," I said softly, "so you refined your technique." I needed consistency, and the rubber heels provided it. "Yes." Miss Fletcher looked stricken. "You stood outside my door." "I never meant," he began, but stopped. "Intent," I said gently, "does not erase effect." There was a pause. "The weeping," Mrs. Whitmore demanded. I turned toward Hale's room and retrieved the narrow metal pipe from his trunk. It was slender, jointed, easily concealed. "This," I explained, "placed beneath the threshold, allows sound to travel along the corridor. The voice, confined and distorted, acquires a hollow resonance." I demonstrated softly, producing a low vibration through the pipe. Even in daylight, the effect was unsettling. Miss Fletcher closed her eyes briefly. "I thought someone was suffering." "In a sense," I said quietly, "someone was." Belle looked at me sharply. "You believed yourself the victim of circumstance," I continued. "Financial strain, mounting debts, diminishing prospects. You saw rooms as numbers. Fewer tenants meant lower overall cost, perhaps opportunity for expansion." He nodded faintly. "I thought if a few left, just 2 or 3, I could renegotiate, secure space cheaply, reorganize. I am not dishonest by nature. I only adapted." "Yes," I said. "Adaptation is a powerful justification." The residents shifted uneasily. No one spoke. "Let us be clear." I continued. This was not hysteria, not imagination. It was orchestration, patterned sound, repeated at calculated intervals. I walked slowly up the staircase. "Notice the placement. Mr. Hale's room lies nearest the stairs. He required only seconds to emerge and retreat. Opportunity and proximity are intimate companions." Hale's shoulders sagged further. "Each night," I said. "The performance grew easier. Habit removes resistance. What begins as transgression becomes routine." He lifted his gaze. "I did not anticipate how frightened they would be." "Fear," I replied, "is rarely proportionate." Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened, not in forgiveness, but in weary comprehension. "You might have come to me and confessed insolvency." Belle said bitterly, "You would have reduced my rent out of charity." "Perhaps not," she answered honestly, "but I would not have driven you into deceit." He looked away. I descended once more. "There is another element," I said quietly. "Timing." Belle stiffened. "You chose 11 minutes past midnight. Why?" He hesitated, then answered, "It is late enough that the house is settled, and early enough that no one expects movement. Precisely at that hour, the mind is least rational, half dreaming, half waking. It receives impressions without defense." Miss Fletcher shivered. "You exploited physiology," I said mildly. A faint flush crept along Hale's cheek. "And you paused deliberately near certain doors, particularly those of tenants you knew to be anxious." "I never meant harm," he whispered. "No," I agreed. "You meant profit." Silence settled again, heavier now but cleaner. Mrs. Whitmore drew a steadying breath. "What is to be done?" Belle straightened slightly. "I will leave." I considered him for a long moment. "Departure," I said, "would be the simplest resolution, but not necessarily the most instructive." He looked puzzled. "You shall remain," I continued. "If Mrs. Whitmore permits, you will write to those who have given notice. You will explain the truth without embellishment. You will assist in repairing the physical damage, and you will endure the scrutiny of your fellow tenants." Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He shall stay for now." Miss Fletcher studied Belle. "If there is another sound—" "There will not be," he said firmly. I believed him. That evening, I remained awake past midnight, seated discreetly in the shadow of the stairwell. I wished to observe not sound, but absence. The house breathed, pipes settled. A distant carriage passed in the street. No tapping, no measured procession. Yet what interested me most was Bell himself. Shortly before retiring, he approached the second stair from the landing. He knelt and ran his fingers along the scuffed wood. For several minutes he remained there. Guilt, when no longer concealed, acquires a different weight. It presses downward, not upon the house, but upon the individual. He fetched sandpaper and began carefully smoothing the blemish. Wood may be repaired, but the indentation in habit, that demands vigilance. When he finished, the mark was faint, almost invisible. He rose and caught sight of me watching. "I will not repeat it," he said quietly. "I believe you," I replied. He looked surprised. "Not because you are incapable," I continued, "but because you have now witnessed the cumulative burden of repetition. Each night required effort, calculation, nerve. Such maintenance is exhausting." He nodded slowly. "It was. And in the end," I said, "the fear you created became your own. You began listening for it." He stared at me. "You stood in darkness waiting for the house to settle. But gradually, you too waited, anticipating discovery." A faint tremor crossed his expression. "Habitual guilt," I said softly, "creates its own haunting." He drew a long breath. By the following morning, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. The corridor no longer felt charged. Doors opened normally. Voices resumed their customary tone. Fear had not vanished entirely, but it had lost authority. As I prepared to depart for the day, Mrs. Whitmore stopped me. "Will they trust him again?" "In time," I said. "Trust is not restored by denial, but by consistency. And if he falters, then the oak will speak again." She gave a small, weary smile. As I stepped into the winter air, I reflected upon the curious gravity of repeated wrongdoing. A single false step may be light, but repetition engraves itself. It leaves marks, on stairs, on souls, on the human spirit. Edward Hale had not created a ghost. He had created a pattern, and patterns, once examined, reveal their maker. The house stood quiet behind me. No spectre lingered in its corridor, only the lesson that fear, when engineered, eventually exposes the engineer. And I, Hercule Poirot, have always trusted that even the faintest indentation may carry the full weight of truth. Chapter 9. The confrontation. There are moments in every investigation when deduction must give way to declaration. The mind has arranged its facts. The pattern stands complete. Yet until it is spoken aloud, confusion continues to breathe. In this house, confusion had breathed for too many nights. I therefore requested that all residents assemble in the sitting room at 6 o'clock precisely. I chose the hour with care. At dusk, shadows lengthen, and imagination regains its strength. But at 6, with lamps freshly lit and the fire newly stirred, the human mind remains steady. It is difficult to fear a ghost while holding a warm teacup. The sitting room filled gradually. Mrs. Whitmore entered first, composed yet visibly strained. She had taken pains with her appearance, as though order in dress might restore order in circumstance. Miss Fletcher followed, pale but resolute, her chin lifted in fragile defiance. Mr. Pritchard stationed himself near the mantel, adopting an attitude of measured skepticism. Edward Hale arrived last. He did not avoid my gaze. That interested me. A guilty man who intends further deception averts his eyes. A guilty man who anticipates exposure meets them, if only to measure the distance between suspicion and proof. When all were seated, I remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began evenly, "we are gathered not to inflame anxiety, but to extinguish it. This house has experienced disturbances which have been interpreted as supernatural. I propose that we examine those disturbances with precision." No one interrupted. "The reports," I continued, "have been consistent, measured footsteps upon the staircase, pauses near certain doors, and, at intervals, sounds resembling subdued weeping." Miss Fletcher's hands tightened. "It is essential," I said gently, "that we distinguish between experience and explanation. You experienced sounds. The explanation attributed to them. That is what we now reconsider." I moved toward the door. "Pray accompany me." We stepped into the corridor together. The stairwell loomed ahead, enclosed tightly by walls that confined both light and sound. "Observe," I said, indicating the staircase. "It is narrow. The central strip of wood is older than its neighbors, slightly raised and more hollow beneath. Such construction produces resonance." Mr. Pritchard gave a skeptical hum. "Stairs creak in any old house." "Indeed," I replied, "but creaking is irregular. What you described was not irregular." I mounted 2 steps and struck the central strip with deliberate firmness. Tap. The sound was muted yet resonant. It seemed to travel downward, as though carried along the grain of the wood. Miss Fletcher inhaled sharply. "You hear how the stair responds obediently to controlled pressure," I said. "It is not the volume of the sound that unsettles, it is its uniformity." I descended and turned to Edward Hale. "Mr. Hale, if you would demonstrate." A faint tremor passed through the group. Bell hesitated only a fraction of a second before complying. He placed his foot precisely where I had indicated. Tap. The sound was identical. He mounted another step. Tap. Then paused. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. "That pause," I said quietly, "was reported on multiple occasions. A halt near the landing. A suggestion of listening." Miss Fletcher's voice was barely audible. "Yes." Bell descended. We returned to the sitting room. "The second element," I continued, "concerns footwear." From a small table near the door, I produced the rubber, tipped boots discovered earlier. These were found concealed in a utility cupboard. Mrs. Whitmore's expression hardened. Bell spoke quickly. "They are not mine, and yet," I replied calmly, "they correspond precisely to a scuff upon the second stair from the landing." I knelt and held up one boot. "Observe this slight indentation in the sole." Mr. Pritchard leaned closer. "It aligns exactly," I said, "with the mark upon the stair." Mrs. Whitmore rose abruptly. "So it was deliberate." Hale's composure faltered. "I experimented, that is all." "Night after night?" I asked softly. He did not answer. "The rubber heel," I continued, addressing the room, "compresses slightly before releasing. This produces a dull, resonant tap, consistent in tone. Consistency is essential to the illusion. Random creaks do not inspire dread, pattern does." I allowed that to settle. Now we come to timing. I consulted my watch. The disturbances occurred at 11 minutes past midnight. "Why?" Silence. "At that hour," I said, "sleep is deepest. The mind floats between dream and waking. Perception is heightened, yet reasoning is subdued. A sound becomes magnified. A pause becomes intention." Mrs. Whitmore stared at Bell. "You chose that hour," he swallowed. "It seemed effective." "Effective," I repeated. There was a faint stir of indignation. "And finally," I said, "the matter of the lamentation." From my pocket I withdrew the narrow metal pipe recovered from Hale's trunk. "This instrument, placed beneath a door, carries the voice along the corridor. The sound, confined within metal and wood, emerges hollow." I demonstrated softly. A low vibration trembled through the room. Miss Fletcher covered her mouth. "I thought someone was suffering," she whispered. "In a sense," I replied quietly. "Summonin was." I turned fully toward Bell. "You have suggested curiosity. You have suggested jest, but jest does not repeat itself nightly with such precision." He stiffened. "A jest," I continued, "does not modify footwear for consistency. It does not adhere to a schedule. It does not pause strategically outside particular rooms." Hale's voice sharpened. "You exaggerate. I meant no harm." "No harm," I agreed. "Only effect." Mrs. Whitmore's patience broke. "You frighten my tenants," she cried. "You jeopardize my livelihood." Bell turned toward her with strained defensiveness. "I am struggling. My accounts are failing. I needed." "Needed what?" Mr. Pritchard demanded. Hale's jaw tightened. "Space." The word fell heavily. "Space," Mrs. Whitmore repeated. "Yes, If rooms became vacant, I might negotiate additional space at reduced cost. I could reorganize my business, expand, recover. And so, I said gently, you manufactured vacancy. Silence descended. You unsettled the others, I continued, hoping they would depart voluntarily. Fewer tenants, lower competition, greater leverage in negotiation. Hale's shoulders sagged. It was not malicious, he muttered. No, I agreed. It was practical. The word struck with greater force than accusation. The illusion had a practical purpose, as most illusions do. Miss Fletcher stared at him in disbelief. You frightened us for advantage. I did not anticipate such panic, he said weakly. Fear, I replied, is rarely proportionate to its cause. Mrs. Whitmore drew a steady breath. You might have approached me honestly and confessed insolvency. Belle said bitterly, you would have reduced my rent out of sympathy. Perhaps not, she answered. But I would not have been deceived. He had no reply. I stepped closer. Mr. Hale, I said softly, there is a difference between desperation and design. Desperation may explain a single act. Design sustains repetition. His composure fractured. Yes, he admitted at last. I continued, I calculated, I timed it. There it was. Confession spoken before witnesses possesses a cleansing severity. When stripped of darkness, I said evenly, the illusion appears small. Not grand, not sinister, simply small. The word echoed more deeply than any tap upon the stair. Bell lowered his head. Mrs. Whitmore spoke with measured firmness. You will write to those who have given notice. You will explain fully. If they remain, it will be by their choice. He nodded. And if another sound is heard, there will not be, he said. I believed him. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Recognition replaced dread, anger replaced superstition, and anger, though uncomfortable, is healthier. It engages reason, Mr. Pritchard exhaled slowly. So there was never anything beyond us. Only intention, I replied. Miss Fletcher's posture relaxed as though a weight had lifted from her spine. Bell looked at me with a mixture of resentment and reluctant respect. You could have exposed me more harshly. Harshness, I said calmly, is unnecessary when proportion suffices. The group began to disperse. Voices resumed their natural tones. The fire crackled without conspiracy. I remained near the staircase for some minutes afterward. The house seemed to settle, not in fear, but in relief. The boards creaked ordinarily. The pipes murmured without design. Mrs. Whitmore approached quietly. You have given the house back to itself, she said. No, I replied. The house was never at fault, only its tenant. She allowed herself a faint smile. As I prepared to leave, I glanced once more at the stairwell. It stood silent, dignified, ordinary. The haunting had not required exorcism. It required explanation. The illusion, once illuminated, possessed no grandeur, only calculation. It had been constructed not from ancient tragedy, nor from hidden crime, but from modest ambition and financial strain. And yet, how swiftly imagination had elevated it into something formidable. Such is the curious partnership between architecture and anxiety. But reason, applied patiently and publicly, restores proportion. The confrontation had not been dramatic, it had been deliberate. And in that deliberation lay its strength, for when illusion is forced into daylight, it does not rage, it diminishes. And I, Hercule, Poirot, have always trusted that what diminishes under scrutiny was never formidable to begin with. Chapter 10. Silence at 11 minutes. Past midnight, the corridor remained silent. I note the time precisely not because precision is a vanity, but because in this case, time had been a tool, and tools must be accounted for. For several nights the house had been trained, like a well-drilled servant, to offer its performance at nearly the same hour. Now the cue was absent, and the house, relieved of instruction, did not speak. I sat in the chair at the foot of the staircase. The lamps turned low. My eyes directed not toward the darkness, but toward the small, ordinary details. That darkness had lately exaggerated, the slight tilt of the runner on the second step, the faint dullness where a foot had repeatedly struck the central strip, the polished banister worn by innocent hands. In quiet, an old house has its own vocabulary. It creaks, it settles, it breathes, but it does not rehearse. It does not pause theatrically outside a door. It does not tap with intent. Mrs. Whitmore had insisted on staying awake as well, though I had advised her otherwise. She sat with stiff endurance in the sitting room beyond. Listening for what she had come to believe was no longer possible. It is not easy for a sensible woman to forgive herself for superstition. She wished to prove to herself, by witness, that her reason had been restored. Before the hour arrived, she emerged, shawl about her shoulders, carrying a tray. "You will take tea, Mr. Poirot," she said. It was not a question. I accepted the cup. The warmth steadied the hands, and perhaps the mind likes to anchor itself to a sensation. That is one reason why fear employs sound, because sound is physical, undeniable, and thus persuasive. Mrs. Whitmore's gaze moved to the staircase, then away again as though ashamed. "It is strange," she said quietly, "how quickly one becomes obedient." "To what?" I asked. "To dread," she answered. "After the first night," I said, "it is nothing. After the second, I said, it is odd. By the third, I had rearranged my entire life around that corridor. I spoke softly. I hurried upstairs. I watched faces for signs of panic. I began to believe the house had turned against me. I stirred my tea. The house turned against no one. Only a person used the house. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a sigh. And yet she stopped. "You are not alone," I said gently. "People believe what they can bear. Sometimes it is easier to believe in a ghost than to believe that a fellow human being has chosen to frighten them for gain." She looked at me quickly. "You think that is why we all accepted it so readily?" "I think," I replied, "that fear is a convenient explanation. It demands no further inquiry. It permits surrender without shame. The mind says, 'It is beyond me.' But when the cause is human, one must ask questions, and questions require courage." She tightened her shawl. "And now, I said, you will allow yourself to sleep. The haunting was a schedule. The schedule has ended." She hesitated, then nodded, and returned to her chair by the fire. I remained where I was, alone with the staircase. 11 minutes past midnight. Nothing. Not the deliberate tap of rubber upon the resonant strip, not the controlled pause at the landing, not the hollow imitation of grief. The silence was not empty. It was full of ordinary life continuing unmolested. It was, in its way, more eloquent than any confession. I rose and climbed the stairs slowly, letting my foot fall naturally. The boards responded with mild, irregular creaks. These were honest sounds, the kind that do not suggest intention. I reached the landing, paused, and listened. Still nothing. Miss Fletcher's door remained closed, the line of light beneath it unbroken. Mr. Pritchard's room was dark. Even the faintest movement would have carried in the narrow corridor, yet the house lay still. At the end of the passage the window showed a rectangle of night, and beyond it a street lamp burned steadily, indifferent to human dramas. I stood for a moment, looking out. When one removes a trick, what remains is often instructive. The house did not feel cleansed by ceremony. It felt restored by simplicity. It had been misinterpreted. Now it was understood. I returned downstairs. Mrs. Whitmore's head was bowed, but her eyes opened as I entered. "It is quiet," she whispered, as though the word might wake the very thing she hoped had gone. "It is quiet," I agreed. Her breath left her in one long exhalation that seemed to carry away several nights of accumulated tension. She put her hand to her mouth, then lowered it with a kind of solemn relief. "I shall never again," she said, "allow myself to be guided by what frightens me." I did not contradict her. One may make such resolutions in the warm certainty of daylight, but I did hope she would remember at least this, that fear is rarely a message from the outside world. It is often a message from the inside one. "Go to bed," I said. "You have paid too dearly for wakefulness." She stood, hesitated, then inclined her head with the dignity of a hostess who has suddenly been permitted to be only human. "Good night, Mr. Poirot. Good night." When she had gone, I remained a few minutes longer, considering not the mechanics, those were settled, but the peculiar morality of what had occurred. Edward Hale's scheme was not magnificent. It was not a labyrinth of violence, nor a masterpiece of villainy. It was petty and practical, fear deployed as an instrument of economics. Yet in that pettiness there was something instructive. For the world is not ruined only by grand crimes. It is also bruised by small ones that repeat themselves until they become habit. Habit is the most persuasive accomplice. Bell had not set out to become a tormentor. He had set out to relieve himself. But relief achieved by making others uncomfortable is a poison that spreads quietly. One begins with a single dishonest act. One repeats it. Soon the repetition becomes less difficult than stopping. The mind says, "Only once more." It says it again the next night, and in the end, one finds that the very silence one sought, the silence of empty rooms, of reduced costs, has been filled with the noise of one's own conscience. I listened to the house. It remained quiet. At last, satisfied, I retired to the guest room Mrs. Whitmore had insisted I accept. Sleep came easily, which is always, for me, an indication that the mind is at peace. A mind troubled by unresolved detail does not permit itself rest. Morning brought a pale sun and the clean briskness of winter air. The house stirred gradually, kettles set on, footsteps in slippers, the muted clatter of breakfast trays. It was remarkable how quickly ordinary life returns when fear is dismissed. One might almost believe fear has never existed, until one notices how tenderly people treat the quiet, as if any careless movement might frighten it away. I found Mrs. Whitmore in the hallway, already dressed for the day. She looked older than she had a week ago, but in a manner that suggested hard learning rather than defeat. "They slept," she said, meeting my eyes. "All of them, even Miss Fletcher. She did not come out once." "Then the house is returned to its proper function," I replied. "It lodges the living." She gave a small smile, then turned her head toward the staircase. "He is leaving," she said. Edward Hale appeared at that moment, carrying a modest suitcase and the battered trunk I had examined earlier. He had chosen the earliest hour for departure, an instinctive desire to avoid the fuller gaze of his fellow tenants. Yet some were already present. Mr. Pritchard stood near the hat rack with his coat half on, as though he had arranged his morning to coincide with this scene. Miss Fletcher hovered behind the sitting-room door, not hiding exactly, but not seeking attention either. In her face there remained the indignation of someone who has discovered that her fear was not proof of a mysterious world, but evidence of another person's manipulation. Bell set the trunk down, breathing through his nose. He looked at none of them at first. Then, perhaps compelled by some final impulse of decency, he lifted his head. "I am leaving," he said. No one replied. He cleared his throat. "I have written to those who gave notice. I have admitted everything." Mrs. Whitmore's voice was flat, but controlled. "They will decide for themselves whether to return. If they do not, you will reimburse me the cost of vacancy until the rooms are occupied again." Hale's face tightened. "I will." Miss Fletcher spoke at last. "Why did you choose my door?" It was a simple question quietly asked, yet it struck with surprising force. Bell blinked, as though unprepared for the intimacy of it. "You seemed anxious," he said, "and you wished to make me more so." He did not deny it. "I thought you would leave first." Miss Fletcher's eyes brightened with hurt more than anger. "You used the weakness you perceived in me." Bell swallowed. "Yes. There are moments when apology is not a balm but a confession of inadequacy." He said it anyway. "I am sorry." Mr. Pritchard's mouth twisted slightly. "Sorry is cheap," he remarked. "Like your rent would have been." Bell flinched. I stepped forward, not to defend him but to prevent the scene from turning into something that would harden rather than heal. "It is done," I said quietly. "Anger is justified, but do not let it become another tenant that never leaves." Mr. Pritchard looked at me, then gave a reluctant grunt that might have been agreement. Hale's gaze shifted to me with a strange mixture of resentment and relief. He had feared humiliation. He had received it, but in measured portions. He had feared exposure. He had been exposed. Yet there remained one thing he did not understand. Perhaps could not. "You are letting me go," he said abruptly. "I am not a jailer," I replied, "nor a judge. If Mrs. Whitmore wishes to involve the authorities, that is her right. But your act, while cruel, does not require a public spectacle to be corrected. It requires that you learn what your arithmetic omitted." He stared. "What did I omit?" he asked, not insolently now, but genuinely. "The cost," I said simply, "not the financial cost. The human one." Hale's face tightened. Then, as though he could not hold the tension, it softened into something that looked almost like shame. He lifted his suitcase. Mrs. Whitmore opened the front door without ceremony. The cold air rushed in. Belle stepped onto the threshold, hesitated, then turned. "I will pay," he said again, as if repetition might strengthen the statement. "I will make it right as far as I can." He went out. The door closed behind him with a firm finality. For several seconds no one moved. Then Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps surprised by the ease with which the departure had occurred, rested her hand against the door as though to reassure herself that it was real. "It is over," she said quietly. Miss Fletcher nodded, and for the first time I saw the lines in her face loosen. "Yes," she said, "it is over." Later that morning, after the house had resumed its normal rhythm, Mrs. Whitmore invited me to take tea once more. She did so with the same stiff propriety as before, but now there was a faint warmth beneath it, as if her pride had found room for gratitude. "You will go now, Mr. Poirot," she said, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement of inevitability. "Yes, I confess," she continued, choosing her words with care, "that when you first spoke of motive and profit, I found it almost offensive. The idea that anyone would do such a thing simply for money, for advantage." I corrected gently. She frowned. "Is there a difference?" "There is always a difference," I replied. "Money is a number. Advantage is a feeling. People do astonishing things to obtain feelings they believe will save them. Security, superiority, relief." She considered that. "And you saw it at once." "I saw the shape of it," I said. "Not at once. At first there was the sound, and then the pattern. But pattern is only half the matter. One must ask, who benefits?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "That question I shall remember. It is the most practical question in any mystery," I said. "The supernatural rarely explains itself. The human nearly always does." She smiled faintly. "You speak as though you despise the idea of ghosts." "I do not despise," I said. "I simply distrust. A ghost has no need of rent reduction." That earned from her a brief, genuine laugh. She sobered again. "I have been a fool." "No," I replied. "You have been frightened. There is a difference." She looked down at her teacup. "And yet I helped him. I did not question his complaints. I listened when he spoke of hardship. Perhaps I even felt a little sympathy." "Sympathy is not a crime," I said. "It becomes dangerous only when it is manipulated." She nodded slowly. "You provided walls and warmth," I replied. "You are not responsible for another man's choice, but you can offer them something now that you did not offer before. Certainty, certainty." "Truth spoken plainly," I said. "No vague apologies, no embarrassed silence. Tell them exactly what occurred and what will be done to prevent it again. Fear grows in gaps." Mrs. Whitmore straightened. "I will do so." She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "And will you think poorly of me, Mr. Poirot?" I met her gaze. "Madam, I think of you as a woman who endured fear and allowed herself to be corrected by reason. That is not contemptible. It is admirable." Her eyes grew moist, but she blinked rapidly, unwilling to indulge emotion. "I thank you," she said simply. When I took my leave, I walked once more through the east corridor. It appeared unchanged. The same narrow passage, the same framed prints, the same worn carpet. Understanding returns the ominous to the ordinary. I paused at the second stair from the landing. Hale's scuff had been sanded away in the night. The wood was slightly lighter there, the varnish newly disturbed. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. Imperfection, too, can be honest. It reminded one that something had happened, but also that it had ended. At the foot of the stairs I turned and looked up. The staircase was simply a staircase now. No stage, no instrument, no scheduled performance. The memory of those hollow taps remained, but memory is not haunting. Memory is instruction, if one allows it to be. As I stepped outside, the winter air struck cleanly against my face. The street was busy with ordinary life, a child skipping, a woman hurrying with a basket, a man calling to a friend. No one in that street would have imagined that a lodging house had been held captive by a handful of measured sounds. Yet that too is instructive. Great fear may be manufactured with very small materials. I walked toward the corner where my cab waited, and in the movement my mind did what it always does. It arranged the events into their final order and extracted the principle that would remain after the particulars faded. The most effective spectres are those we construct for advantage. In this case, the corridor had never possessed a phantom. It possessed an instrument sound like suspicion, may be directed with care. One may place a foot upon a resonant plank and create the impression of an invisible traveler. One may employ a pipe and produce lamentation where none exists. One may choose an hour when minds are weakest and thus guarantee the maximum effect from the minimum effort. This is the essence of manipulation. Maximum effect, minimum effort, guided by knowledge of human vulnerability. And when one identifies who benefits from a haunting that can be scheduled, the mystery resolves itself not in terror, but in arithmetic. Arithmetic is not romantic. It is not even dramatic. But it is honest. 2 lodgers give notice. That is a number. Rooms become vacant. That is a number. Vacancy permits negotiation. That is a number. Advantage is gained. That is the conclusion. It is always wise, therefore, when confronted with fear that arrives conveniently, at the same time each night, in the same place, with the same rhythm, to ask not, "What is it?" but "For whom is it useful?" In matters of crime, as in matters of commerce, one must always ask, "Who profits?" And so I returned to that precise moment, 11 minutes past midnight. An odd time, perhaps. But in its oddity, there was the truth. A haunting that keeps an appointment is no haunting at all. It is a business arrangement. Who profits at 11 minutes past? In this house. The answer had been simple. A young man with debts, a desire for space, and the willingness to borrow terror as a negotiating tool, but in other houses. And I have seen many such questions lead to darker arithmetic. The cab door closed behind me. The lodging house receded from view. Yet the lesson remained as clear as the winter air. Terror is rarely a visitor from beyond. More often it is a tenant invited in by human need, human greed, or human desperation. And when one remembers to count who benefits, even the loudest ghost becomes, at last, only a sum.